The dusty streets of Torrance, California stretched endlessly under the blazing summer sun of 1993. 22-year-old Marcus Thompson stepped out of his beaten Chevrolet Cavalier, sweat already beading on his forehead as he stared at the modest storefront before him. The faded sign read, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Academy, in simple black letters against a white background. This was it, the place that would either make him or break him. Marcus had driven 3 hours from his small apartment in Fresno, carrying nothing but a gym bag filled with borrowed workout clothes and a determination born from desperation. 6 months ago, he had been jumped outside a convenience store back home, left bruised and humiliated on the cold pavement. The memory still burned in his chest, not just the physical pain, but the crushing realization that he could not protect himself. The bell above the door chimed as he entered the academy. The smell hit him immediately, a mixture of sweat, rubber mats, and something else he could not quite identify. Later, he would learn it was the scent of dedication, of countless hours spent grinding against opponents, of dreams forged in submission and victory. Behind the front desk sat a young woman with kind eyes and calloused hands. She looked up from her paperwork, offering a welcoming smile that immediately put Marcus at ease. "First time?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight Brazilian accent. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his oversized t-shirt and basketball shorts. Around him, he could see other students dressed in white uniforms, their movements fluid and purposeful as they stretched and prepared for training. "I am Lucia Gracie," the woman said, extending her hand. "My husband Rorian is teaching the beginners class today. You picked a perfect time to start." She handed him a waiver form and pointed toward a small changing area. "The uniform is not required for your first class, but you will need one if you decide to continue." As Marcus filled out the paperwork, he could hear sounds from the main training area. The slap of bodies hitting mats, the shuffle of feet, and occasional words of instruction in accented English. His hands trembled slightly as he signed his name. This was not just enrollment in a martial arts class. This was his chance to become someone different, someone stronger. The main training area was larger than it appeared from outside. Thick blue mats covered the entire floor, and mirrors lined one wall. About 15 students were scattered across the space, most wearing white uniforms with colored belts tied around their waists. Marcus noticed immediately that he was not the only newcomer. A few others wore street clothes, looking just as nervous and out of place as he felt. A man in his 40s approached the group. Rorian Gracie moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his entire life perfecting his craft. His presence commanded respect without demanding it, and when he spoke, even the most experienced students stopped what they were doing to listen. "Welcome, everyone," Rorian began, his Brazilian accent warm and inviting. "For those who are new, Jiu-Jitsu is not about being the strongest or the fastest. It is about technique, leverage, and timing. A smaller person can defeat a larger opponent through proper application of these principles." Marcus found himself hanging on every word. This was exactly what he needed to hear. At 5 feet 8 inches and weighing barely 160 pounds, he had always been at a disadvantage in physical confrontations. But here was a man telling him that size did not matter. That technique could overcome brute strength. The class began with basic movements: how to fall safely, how to move on the ground, how to maintain proper posture. Marcus struggled with concepts that seemed foreign to his body. His muscles, accustomed to sitting behind a desk at his accounting job, protested against the unfamiliar positions. Sweat poured down his face as he attempted to mirror the instructor's demonstrations. During partner drills, Marcus was paired with another beginner, a construction worker named Dave, who had driven down from Bakersfield. Dave was bigger and stronger, but like Marcus, he was completely lost in this new world of leverage and technique. They fumbled through the exercises together, both men realizing how much they had to learn. As the class progressed, Marcus began to understand why this art was called the gentle way. There was no striking, no aggressive movements designed to hurt an opponent. Instead, everything was about control, about neutralizing threats through positioning and submission holds that could end a fight without causing permanent damage. The final portion of class was live training, actual grappling between partners. Marcus watched nervously as more experienced students engaged in what looked like a complex dance of human chess. Bodies moved in constant motion, each person seeking dominant positions while defending against their opponent's attacks. When his turn came, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the speed and intensity of even this controlled combat. Dave managed to pin him down within seconds, and Marcus tapped out immediately when he felt a chokehold tightening around his neck. The sensation was terrifying and humbling. He had just experienced firsthand how vulnerable he truly was. As class ended and students began to disperse, Marcus sat on the edge of the mat, completely exhausted but strangely energized. His body ached in places he did not know could ache, and his uniform was soaked through with sweat. But for the first time in months, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Several students approached him as he gathered his things. They offered encouragement, shared their own stories of early struggles, and assured him that the learning curve was steep but manageable. Their friendliness surprised him. He had expected martial artists to be intimidating and standoffish, but these people seemed genuinely interested in helping him succeed. As Marcus walked back to his car, the Southern California sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. He knew he would be back tomorrow and the day after that. This was just the beginning of what he sensed would be a transformative journey. The weak, frightened man who had been attacked 6 months ago was still there, but now he had found a path forward. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus first walked through the doors of the Gracie Academy, and his body was beginning to adapt to the rigorous demands of daily training. Every morning at 5:30, his alarm would pierce through the pre-dawn darkness of his small Torrance apartment, which he had rented specifically to be closer to the academy. The decision to relocate had not been easy. It meant leaving his stable accounting job in Fresno and taking a significant pay cut at a local firm, but Marcus knew that half measures would not transform him into the person he needed to become. The morning ritual had become sacred to him. Black coffee, 2 pieces of toast, and a banana, fuel for the 2-hour session ahead. By 6:15, he was on the mats, stretching alongside the handful of other dedicated students who chose to train before the world woke up. These early sessions had a different energy than the evening classes. There was less talking, more focus, and an almost meditative quality to the repetitive drilling of fundamental techniques. Rorion had taken a particular interest in Marcus's development, perhaps recognizing the hunger in his eyes or the way he absorbed every detail of instruction. The Brazilian master would often pull him aside after class to work on specific techniques, correcting subtle errors in positioning that made the difference between success and failure. Jiu-jitsu is like learning a new language, Rorion would say in his patient voice. At first, the words feel strange in your mouth, but eventually, you think in this language. Marcus was beginning to understand what he meant, concepts that had seemed impossible 3 weeks ago, escaping from underneath a larger opponent, transitioning smoothly between positions, recognizing submission opportunities, were starting to feel natural. His body was developing muscle memory for movements that defied conventional logic. Where once he would have used strength to force his way out of bad positions, he was learning to use technique and timing instead. The physical transformation was obvious. Marcus had lost 15 pounds of soft office weight and gained lean muscle from the constant grappling. His hands, once smooth from keyboard work, were now calloused and strong. More importantly, his confidence was growing with each small victory on the mats. Yesterday, he had successfully escaped from a submission attempt by a more experienced blue belt, using a technique Rorion had shown him just days before. But the real changes went deeper than the physical. Marcus found himself approaching problems at work differently, thinking more strategically and remaining calm under pressure. The lessons of jiu-jitsu, patience, persistence, and the understanding that every problem had a solution if you looked at it from the right angle, were bleeding into every aspect of his life. The academy had become his second home, and the other students were becoming like family. There was Carlos, a firefighter who trained religiously despite working 24-hour shifts. Sarah, a nurse who had started jiu-jitsu after being assaulted at the hospital where she worked. Tommy, a college student who was planning to compete in the first UFC tournament that everyone was talking about. Each person had their own reason for being there, but they all shared the same dedication to improvement. Dave, his original training partner from that first day, had become his closest friend at the academy. The big construction worker from Bakersfield had been making the same journey every day, sleeping on Marcus's couch 3 nights a week to avoid the long drive. Their friendship had been forged through countless hours of drilling techniques and rolling together, learning to trust each other completely in the vulnerable moments of training. Today's class focused on guard techniques, fighting effectively from your back when an opponent was on top. For most martial arts, being on your back was considered the worst possible position, but jiu-jitsu had revolutionized that thinking. From the guard, Marcus learned, he could control distance, set up sweeps to reverse positions, and even attack with submissions. It was counterintuitive, but like everything else in this art, it worked when applied correctly. The guard is like a spider web, Rorion explained to the class, demonstrating with one of the purple belts. Your opponent thinks they are in control because they are on top, but you are the spider. You control the web. He wrapped his legs around his partner's waist and used his grips on the uniform to manipulate the larger man's posture and balance. Within seconds, he had swept his opponent and was now in the dominant top position. Marcus paired with Dave for the drilling session, and they took turns practicing the hip escape that was fundamental to guard work. The movement felt awkward at first, bridging up with the hips while simultaneously turning to create space, but repetition was beginning to make it smoother. Dave's extra weight made him a challenging training partner, forcing Marcus to rely on precise technique rather than strength. During the live rolling session at the end of class, Marcus found himself matched against Jennifer, a brown belt who had been training for 6 years. The skill gap was enormous, but she had agreed to work with him on specific positions rather than simply dominating him for 5 minutes. She would let him work from various guards, then show him how she was countering his attempts and what he needed to do differently. "Feel how I'm posting my hand here?" she asked, placing her palm on the mat beside his hip. "That's stopping your hip escape. You need to control that arm first, or I'll shut down your movement every time." She demonstrated the concept slowly, then let him try again. This time, Marcus managed to create the space he needed and escape to his knees. These moments of breakthrough were becoming more frequent, and Marcus was starting to see the bigger picture of how all the techniques connected together. Jiu-jitsu was not just a collection of isolated moves, but a complete system where every position led naturally to others. The guard led to sweeps or submissions, dominant positions led to control and finishing opportunities, and escapes led to opportunities to attack. As the class wound down, Marcus sat against the wall with his water bottle, watching the advanced students continue to roll. Their movements looked effortless, like a conversation in a language he was just beginning to understand. Someday, he told himself, he would move with that same fluidity and confidence. Rorion approached him as he was gathering his gear. "You are progressing well," the instructor said simply. "Your movement is becoming more natural, and you are starting to think instead of just react. But remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. The real learning happens when things get difficult." Marcus nodded, understanding that his instructor was preparing him for the challenges ahead. He had heard stories from other students about plateaus in learning, about periods where progress seemed impossible, about the mental battles that were just as important as the physical ones. But for now, he was content to focus on the daily grind of improvement, knowing that each day on the mats was making him stronger, more skilled, and more confident. The sun was setting as he walked to his car, his gi bag slung over his shoulder, and his muscles pleasantly tired from 2 hours of intense training. Tomorrow would bring another session, another opportunity to learn and grow. The journey was far from over, but Marcus was no longer the same frightened man who had walked into the academy 3 weeks ago. He was becoming something new, something better, one technique at a time. 2 months into his jiu-jitsu journey, Marcus faced his first real test outside the controlled environment of the academy. It was a humid Saturday evening in July, and he had just finished dinner at a small Mexican restaurant near his apartment when trouble found him in the parking lot. 3 men emerged from behind a pickup truck as Marcus walked toward his Cavalier. They were clearly intoxicated, their movements unsteady, but their intentions unmistakable. The largest of the group, a man in his 30s with prison tattoos covering his arms, stepped directly into Marcus's path. "Nice car," the man slurred, though Marcus's vehicle was clearly nothing special. "Why don't you let us borrow it for a while?" 6 months ago, Marcus would have frozen with terror. His hands would have shaken as he fumbled for his keys, desperately hoping to escape before the situation escalated. But 2 months of daily training had changed something fundamental in his nervous system. Instead of panic, he felt a strange calm settling over him, his mind automatically assessing distances and positions, just as Rorion had taught him. "I'm not looking for any trouble," Marcus said evenly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. He kept his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but his weight was balanced and ready to move. The lessons from the academy echoed in his mind. Avoid the fight if possible, but if forced to engage, end it quickly and decisively. The second attacker, skinnier but more aggressive, circled around to Marcus's left side. "Trouble already found you, college boy. Hand over the keys and your wallet, and maybe we won't mess up that pretty face." Marcus's training had taught him to recognize when de-escalation was no longer an option. These men had already made their decision, and they were positioning themselves for an attack regardless of his compliance. The third man was moving to cut off his escape route to the restaurant, where other people might intervene or call for help. "Okay," Marcus said, reaching slowly toward his back pocket as if going for his wallet. The movement caused all three attackers to focus on his hands, giving him the split second of distraction he needed. Instead of producing his wallet, Marcus exploded forward, shooting for a double-leg takedown on the largest man. The technique was one of the first he had learned at the academy, drilled hundreds of times with partners of all sizes. His shoulder drove into the man's midsection as his arms wrapped around both legs, lifting and driving through just as he had practiced. The attacker's size advantage meant nothing once he was airborne, and he crashed to the asphalt with Marcus landing in the dominant top position. Before the man could recover, Marcus had transitioned to mount, his knees pinning his opponent's arms to the ground. The position was so dominant that the larger man could do nothing but struggle uselessly beneath him. Marcus could hear Rorion's voice in his head. "From mount, you control everything. Your opponent can only react to what you choose to do." The second attacker lunged forward to help his friend, but Marcus was ready. He caught the incoming punch with a technique called an overhook, trapping the man's arm against his body while simultaneously sweeping his legs. The combination sent the attacker crashing to the ground, and Marcus quickly moved to establish side control, one of the most punishing positions in jiu-jitsu. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds, but the psychological impact on all three attackers was immediate and devastating. They had expected an easy victim, someone who would cower and comply with their demands. Instead, they found themselves dealing with someone who moved with purpose and skill, someone who had turned their numerical advantage into a liability. The third attacker, seeing both his companions neutralized so quickly, began backing away. "This ain't worth it, man," he called out, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Let's get out of here." Marcus maintained his position on the second attacker while keeping visual contact with both other men. His training had taught him that fights rarely ended cleanly, that opponents would often regroup and attack again if given the opportunity, but he also knew that his goal was escape and safety, not domination or revenge. "Walk away," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying an authority he had never possessed before his training began. "All of you, walk away now, and this ends here." The man beneath him was struggling to breathe under the pressure of the side control position. Marcus had learned to distribute his weight in a way that made it extremely difficult for opponents to escape or even get comfortable. The psychological effect of being completely controlled by someone smaller was breaking down the attacker's will to continue fighting. "I can't breathe," the man wheezed, tapping frantically on Marcus's leg in an unconscious mimicry of the submission signal used in training. "Then tell your friends to leave," Marcus replied, maintaining the position, but not increasing the pressure. He had no desire to seriously hurt anyone, but he needed to ensure his own safety before releasing control. The largest attacker had managed to get to his feet, but his earlier aggression had been replaced by wary respect. The ease with which Marcus had taken him down and controlled him had shattered his confidence. He looked at his friend trapped beneath the smaller man and seemed to realize that this situation was beyond his ability to handle. "Come on, Tony," he said to the third man. "He's right. This ain't worth it." They began moving toward their truck, but Marcus knew better than to trust their retreat. He waited until they had actually started the engine and begun driving away before finally releasing his control on the second attacker. Even then, he was ready to re-engage if the man chose to continue the confrontation. Instead, the second attacker scrambled to his feet and ran after his departing friends, shouting for them to wait. Within moments, Marcus was alone in the parking lot, his heart still racing but his mind clear and focused. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had validated months of training in the most definitive way possible. As he drove home, Marcus reflected on what had just occurred. The techniques had worked exactly as promised, but more importantly, the mental conditioning had been just as valuable as the physical skills. He had remained calm under pressure, made good decisions quickly, and ended the threat without anyone being seriously injured. At the academy the next Monday, Marcus shared his experience with Rorian and some of the other students. Rather than celebrating the victory, Rorian used it as a teaching moment for the entire class. Marcus did everything correctly, the instructor explained. He tried to avoid the fight, he acted decisively when avoidance was no longer possible, and he controlled the situation without excessive force. But most importantly, he understood that the real victory was going home safely, not proving his dominance over his attackers. Several students asked Marcus to demonstrate the techniques he had used, and he found himself in the unusual position of teaching movements he had only recently learned himself. The experience reinforced his understanding of how the techniques worked and why they were so effective against untrained opponents. Dave clapped him on the shoulder after class. "Man, I can't believe you took on 3 guys and walked away without a scratch. 6 months ago, you would have been lucky to survive that situation." Marcus nodded, understanding that his friend was right. The scared, helpless person who had been jumped outside a convenience store in Fresno no longer existed. In his place was someone who could defend himself and others, someone who had been forged through daily training and tested under real pressure. But perhaps more importantly, Marcus realized that the confidence he had gained extended far beyond physical confrontations. The same principles that made jiu-jitsu effective, remaining calm under pressure, thinking strategically, and persevering through difficulties, were applicable to every aspect of life. He was becoming not just a better fighter, but a better person overall. 5 months after Marcus first stepped onto the mats, the Gracie Academy had evolved from a training facility into something much more profound. A brotherhood that extended far beyond the walls of the gym. The transformation was evident not just in Marcus himself, but in the relationships he had forged with his training partners. What had begun as a desperate search for self-defense had become a journey of mutual growth and unwavering support. The morning alarm still rang at 5:30, but now Marcus was no longer alone in his pre-dawn ritual. Dave had officially moved to Torrance, finding work with a local construction company and splitting rent on a 2-bedroom apartment with Marcus. Their friendship had deepened through countless hours of drilling techniques and pushing each other to improve. Where once they had been 2 strangers fumbling through basic movements, they now moved together with the synchronization that only came from complete trust and shared struggle. Carlos, the veteran firefighter, had become an older brother figure to Marcus. The 42-year-old brought a different perspective to training, one shaped by years of life-threatening situations and the understanding that physical skills were useless without mental toughness. He would often share stories during rest periods between rounds, tales that illustrated how the principles of jiu-jitsu applied to emergency situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. In a burning building, panic kills more people than fire, Carlos had explained one evening after a particularly intense training session. Same thing on the mats. The moment you start forcing techniques instead of flowing with them, you're already defeated. Jiu-jitsu teaches you to stay calm when everything is falling apart around you. Sarah, the nurse who had started training after her assault, had become an integral part of their tight-knit group. Her technical precision and analytical approach to learning complemented the more physical styles of her male training partners. She had an uncanny ability to break down complex positions and explain them in ways that made sense to newer students. More importantly, her courage in facing her trauma head-on inspired everyone around her to confront their own fears and limitations. Tommy, the college student preparing for competition, brought youth and athleticism to their training group, but also a hunger for knowledge that pushed everyone to study the art more deeply. He spent hours after regular classes working on advanced techniques with whoever was willing to stay late, turning the academy into an extended laboratory for experimenting with new positions and strategies. The bond between these 5 training partners had been tested and strengthened through a ritual that had become sacred. To them, the Saturday morning marathon sessions. Every weekend, they would arrive at the academy at 6 a.m. and train until noon, working through fundamental techniques, positional sparring, and full rounds of live grappling. These sessions were voluntary, but none of them had missed a single Saturday in 3 months. Rorion had noticed the special chemistry of their group and began tailoring certain aspects of his instruction to challenge them as a unit. He would create scenarios where they had to work together, teaching them how jiu-jitsu principles applied to multiple opponent situations and how to coordinate their movements when fighting as a team. In Brazil, we have a saying, Rorion told them during one such session: "A single stick breaks easily, but a bundle of sticks is unbreakable. You five have become like family, and that bond makes each of you stronger than you could ever be alone." The truth of his words had been demonstrated several times outside the academy. When Dave had been confronted by an angry group of union workers who objected to his non-union status on a job site, Marcus and Carlos had appeared seemingly from nowhere to stand beside him. The would-be attackers, faced with three men who moved with quiet confidence and showed no fear, had reconsidered their aggressive intentions and walked away. Similarly, when Sarah had been followed home from work by a persistent patient who refused to accept that she was not interested in dating him, Tommy and Marcus had taken turns walking her to and from her car until the man finally gave up his harassment. The support was offered without question or expectation of reciprocation. It was simply what brothers did for each other. The most significant test of their bond had come 2 weeks earlier, when Carlos had been injured in a warehouse fire that had partially collapsed. He had suffered severe burns on his arms and smoke inhalation that had landed him in the hospital for 4 days. Without being asked, the other 4 had organized themselves into shifts to ensure that someone was always with him, handling everything from contacting his family to managing his daily needs once he was released. Marcus had been struck by how naturally they had all stepped up to help. There had been no discussion or debate about who would do what. They had simply acted as a unit, each person contributing according to their abilities. Dave had used his construction contacts to help with the physical repairs Carlos's apartment needed for his recovery. Sarah had coordinated with the medical staff to ensure optimal care. Tommy had handled the paperwork and insurance issues that Carlos was too weak to manage himself. The experience had taught Marcus something important about the true nature of strength. Individual skill and technique were valuable, but the support of people who truly understood your journey was irreplaceable. In the darkest moments of Carlos's recovery, when the veteran firefighter had questioned whether he would ever be able to train again, it was the encouragement of his training partners that had kept him from giving up hope. Now, as Marcus sat on the edge of the mat after another intense Saturday session, he watched his 4 closest friends continuing to work on techniques, even though the formal training time had ended. Dave was helping Sarah perfect a sweep that had been giving her trouble. Tommy was drilling submission escapes with Carlos, who was slowly regaining his strength and mobility after the accident. This was what Rorion meant when he talked about jiu-jitsu being more than just fighting techniques. The art had a way of breaking down the barriers people normally maintain between themselves and others. When you trained with someone regularly, when you trusted them enough to practice chokes and joint locks, when you relied on them to help you improve while knowing they were counting on you for the same support, artificial distinctions of background and social status became irrelevant. Marcus thought back to his life before jiu-jitsu, when his closest relationships had been superficial connections with co-workers who he rarely saw outside the office. He had been lonely without really understanding the depth of his isolation. Now he was surrounded by people who would drop everything to help him, and he would do the same for them without hesitation. The transformation went beyond friendship into something more fundamental. These 4 people had seen him at his most vulnerable moments, exhausted, frustrated, sometimes close to tears when a technique he had been working on for weeks still would not come together properly. They had been there for his small victories and his crushing defeats, offering encouragement when he needed it and honest criticism when that was what would help him improve. As the group finally began gathering their gear to leave, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led him to this moment. The frightened man who had walked into the academy 6 months ago had been searching for the ability to defend himself. What he had found instead was something much more valuable: a family of choice, bound together by shared struggle and mutual respect. Tomorrow would bring another training session, another opportunity to learn and grow together. But more than that, it would bring another day of being part of something larger than himself, something that had transformed not just his fighting ability, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be strong. 1 year after Marcus Thompson first walked through the doors of the Gracie Academy, he stood on the same mats where his transformation had begun. But everything had changed. The nervous accountant who had once fumbled through basic movements was now demonstrating techniques to a class of new students, his white belt replaced by a blue belt that represented not just technical proficiency, but a fundamental shift in character and purpose. The promotion ceremony had taken place 3 weeks earlier, with Rorion calling Marcus to the front of the class and tying the new belt around his waist, while his training partners cheered from the sidelines. The moment had been deeply emotional, not just because of the recognition it represented, but because of the journey that had brought him to that point. Every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, every small victory had led to this acknowledgement that he had truly become a student of the art. But the belt was just a symbol. The real transformation was evident in how Marcus carried himself, how he interacted with others, and how he approached challenges both on and off the mats. The confidence he had gained was not the false bravado of someone trying to prove himself, but the quiet assurance that came from knowing he could handle whatever life threw at him. His role at the academy had evolved naturally over the months. Rorion had begun asking him to help with beginner classes, recognizing that Marcus had a gift for explaining techniques in ways that newer students could understand. There was something powerful about learning from someone who had recently walked the same path, someone who remembered exactly what it felt like to be overwhelmed and confused by concepts that now seemed second nature. This morning's class was particularly meaningful to Marcus because among the new students was his younger brother Jake, who had driven down from Fresno after finally accepting Marcus's repeated invitations to try jiu-jitsu. Jake was everything Marcus had once been: soft from office work, lacking confidence, uncertain about his ability to handle himself in difficult situations. Watching his brother struggle with the same basic movements that had once frustrated him, Marcus felt a deep empathy and determination to help guide Jake through the early stages of learning. "Remember, the technique works because of leverage, not strength," Marcus explained patiently as Jake attempted to execute a basic hip escape. "You're trying to muscle your way out, but that's exactly what a bigger opponent wants you to do. Let me show you again." He demonstrated the movement slowly, emphasizing the subtle details that made the difference between success and failure. Jake watched intently, asking questions that Marcus recognized from his own early days of training. The cycle was continuing, knowledge and experience being passed from one generation of students to the next, each person helping those who came after them. Dave had earned his blue belt 2 months before Marcus, and Carlos had returned to training with a fierce determination that had impressed everyone at the academy. His burns had healed well, leaving scars that he wore as badges of honor rather than sources of shame. Sarah had become one of the most technical students in the intermediate classes, her analytical mind perfectly suited to the chess-like nature of advanced jiu-jitsu. Tommy had competed in several tournaments, representing the academy with distinction and bringing back medals that hung proudly on the academy wall. Their Saturday morning sessions had evolved into something approaching legendary status among the other students. The 5 friends would arrive before dawn and train with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, pushing each other to levels of performance that none of them could have achieved individually. New students would sometimes watch in awe as they flowed through complex sequences of techniques, their movements synchronized through hundreds of hours of training together. But perhaps the most significant change in Marcus was how he viewed his role in the broader community. The defensive mindset that had originally brought him to jiu-jitsu had expanded into something more proactive and generous. He had begun volunteering at a local youth center, teaching basic self-defense concepts to teenagers who faced many of the same challenges he had once encountered. The work was unpaid and often frustrating, but it gave him a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal improvement. The program had grown from 5 reluctant participants to more than 30 regular attendees, young people who were finding in jiu-jitsu the same sense of empowerment and community that had transformed Marcus's life. Some of them had started training at the Gracie Academy, creating a pipeline of new students who understood that martial arts was about much more than fighting. One particular success story stood out in Marcus's memory. A 16-year-old named Kevin had started the program as an angry, aggressive kid who had been suspended from school multiple times for fighting. Through consistent training and mentoring, Kevin had learned to channel his aggression into productive outlets and had developed the self-control to walk away from confrontations that would have once escalated into violence. He was now one of Marcus's assistant instructors, helping newer students with the same patience and understanding that had been shown to him. These experiences had taught Marcus that strength was not just about being able to defend yourself, but about using your abilities to help others become stronger as well. The confidence and skills he had developed through jiu-jitsu were not meant to be hoarded, but shared with anyone who was willing to put in the work to improve themselves. As today's class came to an end, Marcus gathered the new students together for a final discussion about what they had learned and what they could expect as they continued training. Jake sat among them, sweat-soaked and exhausted, but clearly energized by the experience. His eyes held the same spark that Marcus remembered feeling after his first class. The recognition that he had found something special, something that could change his life if he was willing to commit to it. Jiu-jitsu is going to challenge everything you think you know about yourself, Marcus told the group, his words carrying the weight of personal experience. There will be days when you want to quit, when the techniques seem impossible, when you feel like you're not making any progress. But if you stick with it, if you trust the process and support each other, you'll discover capabilities you never knew you had. He looked around at the faces of the new students, seeing his former self reflected in their mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Some of them would quit within the first few weeks, discouraged by the difficulty and the ego-bruising nature of learning to fight. But others would persevere, and those who did would find themselves part of a community that would support them through any challenge. After the class dispersed, Marcus sat alone on the mats for a few minutes, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The academy was quiet except for the sound of traffic outside and the distant voices of students changing in the locker room. In this peaceful moment, he could clearly see the arc of his transformation, from victim to survivor to teacher to leader. The frightened man who had been attacked outside a convenience store in Fresno no longer existed. In his place was someone who understood that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to know when to fight and when to walk away, the skills to protect those who could not protect themselves, and the humility to continue learning and growing regardless of rank or recognition. As he gathered his gear and prepared to leave, Marcus smiled at the thought of tomorrow's training session. There would be new techniques to master, new challenges to overcome, and new students to guide along the path he had walked. The journey that had begun with a single desperate decision to learn self-defense had become a lifelong commitment to growth, service, and brotherhood. The white belt beginner, who had lived in training alone, had indeed found that strangers could become brothers through shared struggle and mutual support. But more than that, he had discovered that the greatest victories were not won over opponents, but over the limitations and fears that once defined him. In teaching others to become strong, Marcus had found his own true strength, and that was a lesson that would guide him for the rest of his life.